Some movies crash into your life with noise and spectacle, and then there are the ones that slip in quietly, softly, like a hand on your shoulder at dusk, the kind that makes you turn and realize you've been seen all along. And Pahlawan Terpandang, released in 2025, is that second kind of film, the kind that breathes with you, that asks for your attention not with shouting but with the deep, grounded dignity of ordinary lives. As if every frame is whispering, do you see them? Do you really? See the people who keep the world turning when no one's looking, and right away you feel the title settle in your chest. Pahlawan Terpandang, the unsung heroes we walk past every day, the voices that never make the montage, the faces that never catch the spotlight, and somehow this film becomes a pulse, a low, steady heartbeat that reminds you what cinema can do when it leans in close and listens. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Scenecraft Review, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Because what this review is going to explore isn't just a plot or a performance, it's the rare clarity of a movie that arrives softly and leaves quietly but rearranges your furniture in the night. And when the sun comes up you realize the room is different, your posture is different, the way you look at people in line at the toll booth, the way you hold eye contact with the woman cleaning the mall floor long after it closes, the way your hand lingers a little longer on the railing of a hospital corridor because you remember the weight of exhaustion it sees every day. And so to begin with a little context, this film came out in 2025 in a market overflowing with sequels and the kind of movies that look great in 10-second trailers but vanish from memory almost as soon as the credits roll. And yet, quietly, Pahlawan Terpandang carved out its space, curated screenings, word-of-mouth whispers in coffee shops and on bus rides, and in living rooms where families sat together and recognized a cousin, an uncle, a neighbor in its characters, because the film doesn't sell itself with flash, its confidence is in its restraint, in the cadence of a day starting before dawn in a humid city, in the routine that becomes ritual when you start paying attention, if you let yourself look long enough to let the faces stop being background and start becoming stories, and that's where we find ourselves. A story that is less about one protagonist and more about a constellation, a series of lives in quiet orbit around an idea so simple and so necessary that it feels radical, dignity where people often forget to look for it, a chorus sung softly by voices that are always present but often overlooked, and the film, tenderly, insistently, whispers back that overlooked is not the same as unimportant, unseen is not the same as unworthy, the narrative flows not as a straight line but as a mosaic, a handful of days in a city that could be Jakarta, could be Surabaya, could be any place that hums with traffic and layered histories and language like a woven cloth, and the people we follow are not connected by a dramatic twist or a single calamity but by the simple nature of their labor, the rhythms of their endurance, a night shift paramedic who rides a motorbike through rain-slick lanes at 3 a.m., his eyes flicking between the red blinking of the oxygen monitor and the glisten of puddles catching neon, a sanitation worker whose alarm rings before the sun and whose memories of music and youth are folded into the crackle of a small radio tied to his cart, a sign language interpreter who moves between hospital rooms and courtrooms, lending not just her hands but her attention, her presence, to people who feel invisible even to the institutions built to serve them, a toll booth attendant whose smile is small and patient, a shield against the 1,000 microaggressions of people who never even lift their eyes from their phones, a school cafeteria cook who knows which students will come hungry and arranges second helpings without making anyone feel seen for the wrong reason, and an elderly seamstress who keeps a war medal in a tin, not her own but her late husband's, and who measures quiet heroism in stitches per inch, in a needle threaded even when the power cuts and the light is only a candle she cups to keep from flickering out. And through their days we sense a gentle current that carries us from dawn to dusk to dawn again, and the movie's magic is that nothing and everything happens, which is to say the crises are human-sized, a child with a fever spiking, a tire slowly losing air, a memory of a song half-remembered in a stairwell, a misunderstanding untangled not by dramatic speeches but by someone sitting down, and waiting, and listening. If you're worried about spoilers, don't be, because this is not a film that hinges on an end of real surprise so much as it relies on the accumulation of small truths, details that build like layers of lacquer, each pass adding depth until the surface gleams. And so here's the outline. The paramedic, whose sleeves are always pushed up, carries not just the weight of trauma but the knowledge that his job is to leave a scene and not be remembered, and yet one night he is remembered, just for a second, in a moment so brief you might miss it. A girl's hand tapping the window of the ambulance with gratitude pressed into her palm like a leaf, the interpreter whose hands, graceful and precise, become the film's visual motif, a language that dancingly echoes the camera's obsession with hands at work, hand scrubbing, lifting, rinsing, clasping, giving, the sanitation worker, quiet, whose ritual of tying his shoelaces twice is the closest thing he has to prayer, who finds a small locket on his route and spends the day trying to trace it back, not for reward but because he cannot stand the thought of someone reaching for their missing piece and finding it gone, the toll attendant, who hums the same tune every night as a personal anchor, and on the night she forgets to hum, you feel the tilt of her inner world, the cafeteria cook who learns a student's father has been injured and inexplicably pounds batter as if she could knead hope into hot dough, and the seamstress who, when the neighborhood floodwaters rise, lifts not just her sewing machine to the table but her neighbor's child to the safety of the stairwell, and in that moment the film gives you the thesis it's been whispering under its breath: heroism is not an event, it's a practice. Watching the characters, your impressions aren't shaped by expositional monologues, because the film has a gentle disdain for speeches. Instead, it gives you fragments and trusts you to use your heart as glue. The paramedic's eyes in the review mirror catching the reflection of emergency lights that feel like a sunrise he doesn't get to see, the interpreter pausing in a corridor to sign to herself, as if rehearsing a sentence she'll never be paid for, the worker's shoes leaving a wet trail that the camera follows with reverence, the toll attendant picking up a dropped coin and holding it a second longer than necessary, thinking, always thinking, and in the cafeteria the cook's laugh, which has that particular break in it that comes from someone who doesn't laugh as much as she should. And then there's the seamstress, whose apartment houses quiet artifacts, spools, tin boxes, a faded photograph, arranged like a museum that no one visits but her, and you start to feel a kind of affection that transcends the boundaries of a review, as if, in talking about them, we risk violating the covenant the film creates, that pact to treat these people the way the movie does, with privacy, respect, tenderness. Aesthetically, the film understands restraint not as lack but as choice, and the way it's shot is a study in patient observation, the camera never leering, rarely pushing, mostly gliding with a soft curiosity that lets spaces open up and people breathe, colors washed with an early morning blue and late afternoon gold that turn alleys and kitchens into chapels, and there's a recurring visual language of thresholds, doorways, windows, toll booth frames, ambulance back doors, reminders that so much of this work is performed at the edge of someone else's life. Just outside, the hand passing through to assist, to take, to give back, the soundscape is as deliberate as the images, the world's noise kept in place, from the consistent high whir of fluorescent tubes to the gentle rattle of utensils in a school tray to the layered chorus of scooters and street vendors that rubs against the stillness of a hospital ward at 4 a.m. And you become aware of how often the film chooses to observe silence not as emptiness but as fullness, a container for what cannot be said in words, so that when a piece of music does enter, a thin ribbon of strings, a breath of gamelan texture, a voice humming in the toll booth, you feel it not as an instruction to feel but as an echo of what you already sensed, and this is where the film's emotional intelligence shines, no manipulation, just faithful attention, and it trusts that attention is enough. The performances are crafted with an actor's humility, which sounds like a strange compliment until you see what it looks like in practice, a refusal to demand your approval, a comfort with stillness, with letting a gaze linger a fraction too long, with the courage to not fill the air with talk, and each member of the ensemble carries that ethic in their body language, shoulders rounding mid-shift, hands relaxing after the end of a call, an earbud removed before a conversation that matters, the way a smile is unwrapped slowly, carefully, as if afraid it might break if handled wrong, and when humor emerges, it's not to break tension but to build intimacy, like when the sanitation worker is told by a child that his radio is old and he replies that it is old enough to have a memory, and the child considers that seriously as if perhaps that's a thing radios can do, and in that small moment the film finds the heartbeat of community, a listening, a taking seriously, pacing wise. Be ready for a film that respects your intelligence enough to let you walk alongside it, a tempo set by pre-dawn routines and late-night returns, an editing pattern that favors ellipses, that allows scenes to find their own gravity before cutting away, so that when sequences of urgency do arrive, and they do, you feel them not because the movie forces you to but because you've been living at the pace of its world. The adrenaline becomes yours, and afterward, the come down, the soft exhale of someone wiping a counter clean, hits like a lullaby. And when we talk about themes, there's no sermonizing, but a clear, braided set of ideas emerges. That value is not the same as visibility, that doing good work is not a guarantee of being seen, that the maps we use to navigate who matters and who doesn't can be redrawn if we look up from our own urgency, and the movie, subtly, gracefully, suggests that looking up is itself an ethical act. This is not to say the film is romantic or naive. Because it isn't. It knows the grind, it knows the slow poison of being taken for granted, and it acknowledges the anger coiled under certain smiles, the frustration of fixing the same broken things over and over as if you were bailing out a boat with a cup, the hardness in your jaw after someone rolls their eyes and calls you by a name that's not yours, but it refuses to end there. It chooses to frame these truths inside a larger one. That life is stitched together by the work of people who do it anyway. And that endurance is not absence of pain but presence of purpose. The cultural mood around this release is interesting because, again, it's 2025, and you can feel audiences hungry to anchor themselves in the real, to find in cinema not just escape but return, to walk out of a theater and see their world with sharpened sight, and the film has met that hunger with an honesty that feels almost medicinal. You hear stories of viewers leaving screenings in a hush of conversations that shift from "I like the cinematography" to "I wonder if I've ever thanked the night guard in my building," of social posts that aren't about ranking or hot takes but about naming the people who have quietly saved their days, a public practice of gratitude that doesn't feel performative because the film has gently taught a different grammar: notice, name, honor, and while the movie may be Indonesian in its sensibilities, its attention to community, to intergenerational gestures, to the textures of street food and rain-slick tiles, it resonates anywhere you've ever watched someone work while pretending you didn't see them, which is to say it resonates everywhere, and that universality is achieved not by sanding off specifics but by doubling down on them: the scent of clove cigarettes mixed with disinfectant, the metal-on-metal chime of coins in a toll dish, the rip of vinyl on a motorbike seat, the way sunlight finds the corner of a room for a few precise minutes before slipping away. These textures ground us so fully in a place that the film becomes a bridge instead of a billboard. For those curious about whether this is slow cinema, yes and no. Yes in the sense that it gives you time to be with, no in the sense that it's never inert, because being with is a kind of action too, and I suspect this is why the movie's center of gravity is so stable. It invites patience but pays it back with interest. And if you're wondering whether the stories intersect, they do, but not in the ways that make headlines, more like the way your day and a stranger's day brush against each other and leave a fingerprint, a small exchange at a booth, a borrowed umbrella, a radio voice heard between traffic reports, and there is a late film echo that reframes a detail from earlier, one of those earned moments that feel like a soft revelation rather than a magic trick. And I won't spoil it because the pleasure is subtle and personal, but I will say this: the film believes connections matter more when they're not announced. In terms of filmmaking craft, there's a lot to admire quietly, from the production design that avoids cliches and understands that real spaces are messy but not chaotic, lived in but not staged, to the costume choices that communicate profession and personality with gentle specificity, the paramedic's frayed wristband, the interpreter's neutral tops that let her hands be the bright element, the worker's cap with a stitch where it tore and was mended, the toll attendant's tiny pin, the cafeteria cook's apron handprints darkened with flour, the seamstress's thimble worn smooth, and there's a visual architecture built of recurring frames, hands as motif, but also feet, the ground-level shots that return us to the circulation of the city, the choreography of step, pause, pivot, which is the choreography of labor, the editing uses match cuts that carry meaning between stories, a hand flipping a switch, a wrist turning a latch, a window sliding shut, so you feel how one life's gesture rhymes with another's, and if there's a thesis shot, it might be the one where the sanitation worker pauses to stretch his back and, across the street, the paramedic stretches his hand before putting on gloves, and the two motions, separated by context and class and attention, become a dance, two bodies warming themselves back into purpose, and that's the kind of cinematic rhyme that makes you want to lean forward and whisper, "Yes, that's it, that's the thing." Performance highlights are everywhere and nowhere at once, because the film is allergic to the kind of scene that begs for a compilation reel, and yet, if you've ever watched acting that defers to the larger story, you'll appreciate the discipline here, especially in moments of abeyance, when an emotion rises to the lip and then recedes because the character chooses duty over display, and the tear that doesn't fall is sometimes the one you remember, more than any big breakdown, and the humor, gentle, observational, is delivered with similar restraint. A co-worker's dry comment about how rain puts the city in a dream, an elderly customer who speaks like a sage, a kid who negotiates extra rice like a lawyer. But perhaps what will stay with you most is the feeling that the film trusts you, and that in being trusted you become a better viewer, and maybe, if you let it, a better person in the lobby afterward, or in the taxi, or at the kitchen sink when a plate slips and you think of the toll attendant catching coins with a reflex that looks like grace, because once you see these rhythms, you start to look for them, and once you look for them, you can't stop finding them, the world becoming an anthology of micro-heroics, small acts strung like lanterns along your day. Audience reaction has been heartening in the way that makes you believe movies can still ripple out into real life without needing to be a campaign. People writing about the paramedics who showed up when their father collapsed, about the cafeteria lady who saved them through high school, about the janitor who became their friend, and theaters have reported a quiet trend: people linger, people stay, people don't spring up when the credits roll but let the music finish, and sometimes, if you look downstream on social feeds, you see the afterglow, not just ratings but thank you notes, and you realize the film accomplished something sly and generous. It invited viewers into a chain of recognition. Is it perfect, you might ask? And the answer, depending on how you use the word, is that it's perfectly itself, which is maybe a better thing than being flawless, and if you look for rough spots, you could say there are stretches that might test the patience of someone seeking narrative propulsion. You could say the film insists on staying in moments longer than the conventional grammar allows, but if you give into its tempo, you discover that the excess is not indulgence but offering, like a glass of water filled a little too much by someone who wants to be sure you've had enough, to step back for a second and consider the cultural context. The year matters, a moment when the term essential workers has been said too often and felt too little, when applause from balconies has faded into daily routine again, when the promise to never forget has softened into the familiar forgetting that life trains into us as a survival tactic, and in that context, Pahlawan Terpandang is a small, persistent bell. It does not accuse, it does not shame, it does not brand itself as a corrective, it simply puts its camera where our eyes should be, and in doing so, it nudges the culture, just a bit, toward attention, which is the moral gesture of our time, and you sense that in the weeks after. People see it, there is a softening at the edges of their day, a costing out of time that makes room for a hello, a thank you, a pause. As a reviewer, I'd be remiss not to point out the subtle choices that keep this from being sentimental pap, because it could have been, with a less disciplined hand, a montage of noble suffering, but the movie resists that easy turn. It shows pettiness too, small cruelties, the impulse to cut corners, the occasional lie told to get through a shift. It shows how heroes are not saints and the invisible are not angels, they are people, and that, ironically, makes their acts loom larger because they're not in a storybook, they're in the complex, contradictory stew of the real, and what a relief that is, to be allowed to love them without putting them on a pedestal. Ultimately, my final impression lands here: this is a film that won't shout to be seen, but the ones who need it, the ones who are ready to receive it, will find it, and it will sit with them for days, and they will find themselves telling one of its stories at dinner without meaning to, or quoting something without realizing where they heard it, or reaching for their phone to text someone they've been meaning to thank, and if that's not the kind of cultural impact we should be rooting for, I don't know what is. So if you're choosing what to watch and wondering whether this is worth your time, I'd say it's worth your attention, which is a richer currency, because in exchange it offers you something that might just recalibrate the way you see your world, and that, to me, is the test of a film that matters, not whether it will win trophies or spawn think pieces, but whether it can put a small mirror in your hand and help you aim it toward someone else. And when you do, you might find yourself smiling, because you'll see a hero looking back, not the caped kind but the broom-carrying kind, the glove-wearing kind, the lunch-serving kind, and in that reframing there's a kind of grace we need more of. Pahlawan Terpandang is not here to save you, it's here to show you that maybe you've been saved more times than you realized by people whose names you never learned, and maybe tonight you will, and tomorrow. When the sun comes up and the city yawns awake, you'll see it all freshly washed, not because the rain fell but because your eyes did, and if that happens then the film has done what it set out to do, and cinema, for a brief span of time, did the ancient work it was built to do, to gather us around a fire of light and shadow, to tell us stories of who we are to one another, and to remind us that even in the smallest hours, someone is there, keeping the world from falling apart, unsung but not unimportant, unseen but not unworthy, and it will leave you with a question that's less a demand and more an invitation. What will you notice now? Who will you honor next? And perhaps, most simply, how will you look? And if that's not cause for a celebration in the quiet of your heart, then I don't know what is, but I hope you'll see it, I hope you'll let it in, and I hope it finds you ready, because in 2025, in a world that runs faster than we can name it, a film like this is a gift you unwrap slowly, with clean hands and a full breath, and when you've finished, you put it away carefully, and you carry its echo into your day. where it belongs, so that's where I land on Pahlawan Terpandang, a work of modesty and might, a case study in how attention is love in motion, and I'm grateful to have met it and to share it with you. And if you've watched it, tell me who you saw, who you recognized, and if you haven't, I hope when you do you'll think of someone whose name isn't in the end credits but whose fingerprints are on your life, and maybe you'll send them this review as a small wave across the distance, because sometimes the most cinematic thing we can do is to say I see you, and mean it. And if you want more reflections like this, more deep dives into films that don't just entertain but restore, you know where to find me, you know where the conversation continues, and I can't wait to hear what you found in its quiet corners. And if you thought that was the end of what this film could stir in you, the way a tide seems to have reached its furthest point and then quietly proves you wrong with one more ebb and one more reach, let me take you back into Pahlawan Terpandang and show you the angles you might have felt without yet having words for, because the more I sit with it, the more the movie opens like a day that seems ordinary until you start naming each hour and realizing they each held a different weight, and the filmmakers, wise to that rhythm, thread another set of moments that behave like soft magnets pulling scenes into constellations, so that what at first seemed like separate stories now returns with a deeper gravity, as if the city itself decided to lean in and listen. Take the paramedic again, the man whose sleeves live above his elbows, as if his whole body was designed to be ready, and watch how the film refuses to make him a hero in the poster sense, preferring instead to keep him human and present and a little frayed around the edges. And there's a sequence near the midpoint that haunted me, when a citywide power cut knocks out the lights in several neighborhoods and the ambulance battalion is stretched thin, and we sit inside the van with him and his partner as they navigate streets only half known in the dark, the glow from the dashboard humming like a lullaby, and the partner, younger, taps his fingers to keep focus, not talking, just tapping. And then at a stoplight, that's become a four-way problem. They look right and see the toll booths like lit islands in an ocean of black, the only squares of light left humming on backup power, and for a second the paramedic smiles because in a night of failures those little boxes have become lighthouses, and he doesn't know, but we do, that in one of them the attendant we've been watching has her own little crisis unfolding, a moment where a driver furious at delays takes it out on her, and for a split second you can see the thought cross her face that perhaps people are more dangerous in the dark, but she breathes in, hums a half bar of that tune she uses as an anchor, and gives the exact change with hands that do not shake. And here's where the film's genius for quiet cross-stitching shows up. The paramedic and his van pull forward, and the narrow beam of his headlamp briefly illuminates her face, a split-second portrait in chiaroscuro, a fragment that will mean nothing to either of them and everything to us, because we've been given the privilege of holding both lives at once, and the camera does not milk the moment, it just lets it happen and lets us catch it like a falling leaf. The interpreter, too, finds herself in a scene that, in lesser hands, would have turned into a courtroom drama or a hospital monologue, but here is staging not as spectacle but as a field of attention, because she is called into a late-night intake where an elderly man is disoriented and his adult son is tired in the way that makes you brittle, and the interpreter stands between them not physically but temporally, as if she could hold time open between their gestures long enough for understanding to sit down, and she asks for a second to recalibrate their pace, slowing the son's speech, smoothing the father's memory, and when it works, when the father's hands finally find the sign for pain that had been lost in the fog, you feel that small miracle in your ribs. A pressure releasing, not because someone triumphed but because someone was patient, and that is a kind of heroism we rarely film. Meanwhile, the sanitation worker and the locket, that gold oval with a hinge that squeaks, becomes a breadcrumb trail through the city, and he keeps it tucked against his skin and he asks around casually, not wanting to make anyone feel watched, and when he thinks he's found the owner, an older woman whose hands tremble when she speaks, the film gives the moment space, not to dial up the tears but to let the exchange settle, and she refuses to take it at first, insisting it isn't hers, and then later, when she does open it and sees a picture she'd convinced herself she'd lost to time, she gives not a speech but a look that says, I didn't even know I needed this back. And sometimes the thing we rescue when we return a lost object is not the object but the permission to remember. The cafeteria cook continues to be one of the film's sly center points, and there's a morning when she arrives to find an empty crate, a delivery that didn't happen, and she has to pivot, channeling a grandmother's thrift and an artist's improvisation, and we watch her turn leftovers into something warm and sustaining, the camera close on her hands, oil behaving like sunlight in the pan, and two boys who thought they'd go hungry today don't, and later, when one of them says thank you in that shy way of 12-year-olds who haven't learned how to mean it yet, She chases it down with a laugh that ricochets off the tiled walls and lands in your ear, and the movie is telling you a secret: the real special effects are always hands and heat and care. Our seamstress becomes the quiet keeper of the film's emotional archive, and in a sequence that is also a masterclass in color and patience, she pins a bodice to a dress for a bride who worries her budget will make her look less like a bride and more like a compromise, and the seamstress refuses that script with the flick of a hand, using a strip of lace kept from a job long ago, a small luxury smuggled into a tight world. And in the midst of this, the medal in the tin appears again, not as a plot point but as a weight that clinks when the tin is moved, a reminder that the language of honor can easily become an artifact if not lived into every day. And later, when the floodwaters rise again, the season remembering itself, she moves with deliberate calm, lifting furniture and then lifting a neighbor's child as if both were equally important vessels. Because in her cosmology, they are, one holds a life and the other holds a history. If you're feeling the pattern here, it's because the film is walking you gently toward a thesis that has been there the whole time, that heroism, when it refuses spectacle, becomes a geometry of presence, a set of shapes we make together when we decide to hold and be held, and the movie's craft supports that at every level, especially in how it uses time, not as a metronome to hit beats but as a fabric to sink into, letting scenes breathe to the point where you begin to notice the negative space, the silent seconds before a task begins and the ghost of motion after a task ends, and it's in those margins that the film sneaks up on you. You start spotting the way light treats certain faces softer at the end of a shift, the way a corridor sound changes when dawn is a rumor and not a fact, the way a city's pulse in the rain is different from its pulse in the heat. And the sound design here isn't merely clever, it's tender, honoring the scrapes and clicks and sighs that make up the language of labor, Velcro on a medical bag releasing with honest fatigue, a drain gurgling awake in a flooded stairwell, the staccato of coins across a dish marking the tempo of commuters, the hush that falls in a cafeteria just as the first tray slaps down. And it isn't that the film makes you feel, but that it shows you how much feeling was already happening, if only you would attend to it. What surprised me on a second viewing was how generous the movie is with humor. And the kid spells it like a ceremony, finger by finger, and then beams with the kind of pride that is its own light source, and the interpreter repeats the name with a flourish, and in that tiny exchange you can see a pipeline of future strength being built, one letter at a time, and the movie doesn't call it a victory, but it is. I want to talk about the way the film understands the spiritual without branding it, how it notices the moments when people make offerings to each other without incense or iconography, the toll attendant who puts a bottle of water on the sill for the traffic cop who hasn't left the intersection in hours, the sanitation worker who leaves a clean broom outside a shop that never says please but always says thank you, the paramedic who texts the cafeteria cook after a hard night because the sweetness of her tea is the only medicine he knows will work, the seamstress who tapes a little square of plastic over the crack in her neighbor's window so the rain won't find it again. And these are not acts of charity as much as they are acts of community, small patches sewn into a fabric that otherwise would tear under the weight of relentless days. And in a world that has trained us to love grand gestures, there's something almost radical about championing the micro. In terms of structure, you might not notice on first pass that the film is actually building a cycle, a liturgical calendar of ordinary time. And after it takes you through a neon-drenched night and a burnt sugar morning and a noon that wilts and a late afternoon that hums and an evening that softens, it does it again, not to be repetitive but to let you observe the changes, because the second time you watch a day, you see what your eyes weren't trained for yet, the subtle shifts in gait when a person is tired versus when they are determined, the rare grin that breaks like weather after a period of dry sky, the way a voice on the radio that felt like static now becomes a companion. And when the movie wraps back to scenes that mirror scenes, it's not a trick but a mercy, giving you another chance to pay proper attention. The world of 2025, the context we live in, makes that mercy feel necessary, because so many of us have been moving at speeds that make noticing feel like a luxury, and this film looks at that and politely disagrees, insisting that noticing is a discipline, a practice, a civic duty even, and the audience seems to be meeting it there. If the stories I've heard are any indication, us leaving theaters to catch the bus and suddenly seeing the driver's cracked hands and feeling something catch in our throats, us standing in a checkout line and remembering that someone stocked those shelves at 5 a.m., us realizing that if we let it, the movie could be the beginning of an unglamorous revolution in how we regard one another. I want to linger with the idea of gotong royong, that Indonesian spirit of mutual aid, not because the film says it out loud but because it lives it, the way the characters pick each other up without announcing the choreography, and the movie's form reflects that ethic. No one main character hogging focus, no one arc demanding primacy, a chorus where everyone gets their note, and in practical terms this means the performances are calibrated toward ensemble harmony, a kind of acting that chooses ear over mouth, listening as a primary engine. And what a relief it is to watch actors who know that the secret to presence isn't volume but truth, and I'm thinking especially of the toll attendant's quiet shift from hum to silence after the power cut, the way that tiny change reads like a drumbeat after all the soft strings, and the paramedic's steady breath in the slow motion of crisis, and the cook rolling her shoulders back before lifting a pot that looks too big for her but fits exactly when she decides it will, and the seamstress pricking her finger and smiling at the old familiar sting, as if the body has its own archive of necessary aches. The director's choices avoid calling attention to themselves, but if you're looking, there's craft flexed in every scene, long takes that walk the fine line between immersion and indulgence without tipping, framings that let architecture and geography do part of the storytelling, and a recurring use of reflections, windows, puddles, stainless steel, that plays with notions of being seen and seeing oneself, with one standout shot where the sanitation worker pauses to check the locket's hinge and we see, in the convex gleam of a polished dumpster handle, a tiny funhouse version of his face. Distorted but recognizable, a visual joke and a philosophical nudge at once, what could have been a knockoff of a certain European slow cinema mode becomes distinctly local in the best way because of how the film uses food and traffic and weather as characters, not just settings. You can taste the sambal when the cook stirs it, you can feel the mugginess as the seamstress lays fabric on a table while a fan oscillates lazily, you can hear the rain's different dialects, the rooftop percussion, the street-level hiss, the spatter on a plastic awning, the distant drum on a water tank, each one an instrument in a city orchestra that does not need a conductor to stay in time. There's a moment late in the film, and forgive me for not pinning it to a precise timestamp because it's less a scene than a sensation, when the interpreter, after a long day, sits on the curb with a cup of Iscopi and watches the traffic blur. And the movie lets that blur become abstract art for a beat, red and white and blue streaks melting into each other, and you get this sudden awareness that she, like all of them, like all of us, is both inside the flow and outside it, both part of the blur and someone who can see it, and the power of that double vision is that it allows compassion to grow in the gap. I've said little about the music, and that's partly because the score is less a set of tracks than a feeling. A gentle cushion that never tells you what to feel but gives you permission to rest in it, and when the film does tip its hat to regional sound, it does so with exquisite restraint, a metallophone phrase here, a vocal run there, a handheld radio murmuring an old pop song that someone whistles without thinking, and this choice keeps the movie from becoming a travel brochure and lets it stay what it is, a love letter to the daily. Let me address the inevitable question of stakes. Because we've been taught by certain movie grammars to equate stakes with death or money or world-ending threats, and while there are lives on the line in any emergency, what Pahlawan Terpandang argues is that dignity is a stake worthy of narrative attention, that whether a child eats or a father is understood or a neighbor keeps their room dry or a commuter is treated with respect are stakes that ripple long into the lives that touch them, and that reframe elevates the ordinary into something like sacrament without making it a sermon. And I think that's why people are walking out of this film a little changed, because it reminds us that our small decisions matter and that the metrics we use to measure meaning need recalibrating. On this pass through the film, I surrendered to its patience completely, and in doing so discovered pockets of visual detail that delighted me in the bones, like a row of helmets hung like a minimalist gallery installation inside the ambulance, or the toll attendant's habit of aligning pens so they don't roll, or the seamstress's teacup with a cracked cheese glued more than once, or the cafeteria's steel prep tables reflecting a blurry upside-down world that felt like a dream you half remember. And these things are not there to be brand catalog entries, but to say, look, everything is living under your nose, everything is a story, and if we call this cinematic, we should also call it ethical, an ethics of attention. I can't ignore the way the film shows the friction points too, because there are eruptions. Small ones, a perilously placed stack of boxes that someone bumps into and then swears at, a nurse who snaps at the paramedic and later apologizes, a parent who blames the cafeteria for a child's stomachache when the truth is the child skipped breakfast, and you watch the characters absorb these blows and recalibrate, not with a dead-eyed tolerance of resignation but with a choice to not let a momentary poison define the day. And I found myself thinking about the muscles we rarely talk about, the ones that turn anger into something else, into action or humor or simply the wisdom to walk away, And how those muscles are heroic too. If we step outside the film for a breath and look at how it's landing, you can see a curious phenomenon. It's becoming the kind of movie that people recommend not by sending a trailer but by telling a story from their own life. A taxi driver showing a picture of his first night on the job. A barista mentioning the time a stranger covered someone else's bill when they were short by a few coins. A factory worker talking about the woman who held the elevator door for him every morning at 5, and because the film is about that connective tissue, the recommendations feel less like marketing and more like testimony, and in an era of algorithms, that feels almost ancient, almost sacred, like we've remembered how to pass the flame by hand. I'm careful in this space not to lionize suffering, because the goal isn't to romanticize hardship but to acknowledge the truth that a lot of the world's beauty is built quietly by people who are not asking to be noticed, and the film bears this nuance, giving us rest as well as labor, joy as well as burden, the toll attendant's little dance when traffic slackens, the cook feeding herself a spoonful straight from the pot and closing her eyes, it's so good, and laughing because she let herself enjoy something small, the interpreter texting a joke to a friend mid-shift and getting a sticker in return, the paramedic leaning on the ambulance and feeling the heat of its hood against his palms, grounding himself, the seamstress taking a second to put on lipstick even though she'll be alone most of the day, not for anyone else, for herself, for the mirror, for the woman she sees when she looks past the widow and the worker and finds the girl who loved music. I love the way the film refuses to pin blame for systemic neglect on any one villain, because the villain here is a habit of looking away. Something so pervasive it's like air, and the antidote isn't a crusade but a posture, an adjustment of the head and heart, and you feel that call ripple through scenes like the murmur of prayer heard from a distance, not demanding, just present, a reminder of a frequency you can tune to if you want. If we talk about craft once more, I have to mention the macro shots of hands and tools that border on devotional, the way the fabrics weave becomes a landscape, the adhesive bandage smoothing over a puncture looked at like a healing sunrise, the gleam of a clean dish that, for a second, looks like a hubcap of a moon, and you can tell the cinematographer loves materials, loves surfaces, loves what light does when it is allowed to play, and that love is infectious, because after seeing it you want to go home and clean your own table with a little more attention, not out of compulsion but out of a sense of connection, like you're part of the same choir. The movie's ending. I know we talked about the soft crest and I won't ruin the quiet echo that follows, hums with the energy of something unfinished, which is the smartest kind of ending for a story about daily practice, because you shouldn't tie off the world with a bow when the work will continue tomorrow, and the film trusts you with that, leaving you in the space where your next small act could be the next scene, and what a generous handoff that is from screen to life, in a landscape tumbling over itself to be first and loudest. And in that honesty there is a power that can't be gained. I'll leave you with this image the film gave me that I can't shake, the paramedic at a dawn intersection, helmet on the handlebars, looking down the length of a street that is beginning to remember it is a street, scooters stirring, a cat stretching, a vendor clinking glasses, and for just a second his face softens into something like peace, not because anything dramatic was resolved, but because he knows he will show up again and the city will too, and in that mutual promise there is enough to carry a day. And that's the gift this film offers if you let it, a reintroduction not to your life but to the way you witness it, the way you count it, the way you honor it, and I hope you let it in, and if you have, tell me what changed in your seeing, tell me whose name you said under your breath as you watched, tell me what small thing you did when the credits finished, because sometimes the after story is the best part, and maybe this one is yours. So yes, we could talk about pacing or lighting ratios or the exact hue of the morning blue in that corridor shot. And trust me I could go on about the delicate balance of warm and cool color temperatures that make the city feel at once tender and honest, or the elliptical cuts that skip the melodrama and land us in the hands that clean up after, or the way the camera's height always respects a character's dignity by never tilting down as if to diminish them. But beyond all that, what this movie does is reposition the horizon line, the place where you expect to see the sun come up, and it moves it from the skyline to the faces of the people who start before us and end after us, the ones we too rarely notice until art nudges us gently and says, look, just look, and once you do, you'll find that you can't unknow it, and that's a beautiful problem to have, because it means the world got a little larger inside you. And if you're asking for the score or the rating, I hear you, but I'll keep resisting the easy numbers because I don't want you to reduce this to a checklist. I want you to carry it like a song that doesn't need words, and I want you to meet it halfway with your own stories, because this movie isn't complete without you. That's the trick, that's the magic, and maybe that's why we're still talking, still leaning in, still waiting for the next breath of it to come to us in the glow of a screen and the soft murmur of a room full of strangers all doing the ancient act of watching, together, and if that isn't a kind of gotong royong, a collective attention, I don't know what is, and maybe in that shared gaze we begin to practice the world we want, 1 second of respect at a time, and so, with all that said, if you're still here with me, if you've let the film's textures dust your palms and its rhythms settle in your ear, then you're the kind of viewer this movie was made for, and I'd love to keep walking with you through its streets. Return to the silences that spoke, sit again in the toll booth during the rain, ride one more night with the ambulance, stir one more pot in the school kitchen, thread one more needle by candlelight, because the second telling is always richer, always truer, not because the facts changed but because you did, and maybe that's the sweetest promise cinema can make us, that we won't be the same by the time the lights come up. Just when you think Pahlawan Terpandang has emptied its pockets and shown you all it has to offer, it quietly reaches into that hidden lining where the most fragile things are kept and pulls out another small truth, and the way it does that is by returning you to spaces you already know and letting them reveal a layer you missed. Which is why the third time we sit in the ambulance with the paramedic it's not the siren that you hear first but the rhythm of his breathing, even and deliberate. Like someone counting waves, and you realize he's training himself not just for emergencies but for endurance, because the marathon of care doesn't allow for spectacular collapses, so he breathes, and he remembers a trick someone taught him: press your tongue to the roof of your mouth to keep your jaw from clenching, and you can see him do it, a tiny movement, and it's in these micro-adjustments that the film locates a kind of everyday wisdom, the body becoming a library of small hacks that keep a person whole, and outside the window the city performs its familiar ballet of impatience and necessity, scooters threading through gaps, buses exhaling, pedestrians gaming the timing of lights, and you have the strangest sensation that even in the rush something is bowing to the presence of this unremarkable hero, like the small ways water makes room for a boat that isn't trying to be big, just trying to get where it needs to go, inside a courtroom lit by bars of light and shadow that make the walls look like a page of music. The interpreter stands with a posture that says, I will not introduce myself into this conversation beyond what is necessary, and the ethical clarity of that stance is part of what makes her arc so quietly thrilling, because she is the most crucial person in the room and also the least, her skill designed to vanish into the connection it makes possible, and in a scene where a young man is asked a question that could cost him months of his life if misunderstood, the interpreter splits the difference between two dialects of signing with a grace that teaches you how language can carry mercy not by changing the words but by setting them down gently, and much later, when she walks home past a warung that glows like a lantern in the blue hour, she buys fried bananas and the vendor asks if she's been working late, and she nods, and he doesn't press, and there's this hush that falls, the kind of silence that can only exist between people who agree not to demand explanations from each other, and she leaves with a paper bag warm in her hand and the knowledge that being seen can be as simple as having your fatigue named by someone who has no reason to care except that they do, down by the river, which is not a pretty river but is honest about what it carries, plastic and leaves and reflections of building lights and the occasional miracle of a bird. The sanitation worker finishes his route early because the locket, which had been tugging at his chest whenever a movement made it shift, has finally found its way back to its owner. And though you might expect the film to linger on the reunion, to squeeze it for tears, it does something true, which is to let the woman clasp the chain with her clumsy gratefulness and the worker to smile a little and then turn, not out of coldness but because attention is a gift and it's time to give it elsewhere. And as he walks away he hears music from a nearby stall, a danged-up rhythm that his legs remember before his mind does, and he lets his body catch a beat and then keeps moving, grinning, because the city has just paid him back in a currency he understands, a small celebration that costs nothing and fills you up. The toll attendant, kept in her square of glass and light, has a private universe built of tiny resistances and rituals, the neat line of coins, the folded snack wrappers tucked into a pocket to be thrown out later because she refuses to accept that her job means she must contribute to the litter that gathers in unhappy corners, and there's a night when a stray cat learns her schedule and starts sitting on the median at the time she usually takes a break, and she starts bringing a little food in a container that used to hold face cream, and if you pay attention you'll notice the way her eyes soften every time the cat darts close, the way softness itself becomes armor in an environment that could make a person hard. And at the end of her shift, when she steps out and the night air feels like a room she's been aching to enter. She looks back once, as if to bless the booth for keeping her and the cat for reminding her she is more than the transactions that pass through her hands. The cafeteria cook becomes, in the middle stretch of the film, a maestro whose orchestra includes boiling water and restless children and a timetable that is never quite honest. And there's a sequence where she negotiates with a market seller whose eyes are sharp with the math of survival, and what could have been a simple haggling scene becomes a duet, each person reading the other's humanity between prices and weights, and when they land on a number that works for both of them, the film captures something rare. The exact second a compromise turns into a partnership, and the cook leaves with her basket and an extra handful of chilies for color, and she laughs and says, "For courage." And the seller nods because she knows the truth when she hears it, and then the sempstress, oh the sempstress, who sits in a pool of light that looks like it was poured for her, needle glinting like a star fallen into her lap, and the way she keeps the rhythm of her stitches becomes a barometer for the neighborhood's mood. Because she hears the gossip and the grief and the joy as it flows past her door, and on a day when the rain is more than weather, when it's history, when it threatens to turn a street into a river, she rolls up her dress, bears calves like a young woman's, and wades, not to save her own belongings only but to retrieve a little boy's schoolwork that started to drift, and when she hands it back to him, closed with clothespins like a love letter, she tells him to put it in the oven on the lowest heat, to bake the water out gently, and ask his mother to watch the papers so they don't catch, and you feel the film winking at you, telling you that salvaging is an art and old women are the best artists at it, and that the world would do well to stop underestimating hands that have kept families stitched together for decades. What makes this film so alive is the way it keeps teaching you to hear, not in the way of acoustic perfection but in the way of social listening, and after a while even the background noises start to sound like people talking, not literally but in the emotional grammar of the thing, the plock of rain becoming an old man's cough, the scrape of a chair in the cafeteria sounding like a call to sit and be fed, the beep of a heart monitor less like a threat and more like a metronome for courage, and in making that shift you realize that the film hasn't softened the world so much as introduced you to its undersong. The music of maintenance, the score that plays when the credits would usually roll in other movies because the superheroes have saved the day, but here the heroes are the credits, they are the names that scroll past and you never read, and now you do. There's a strand in the film that takes its time to blossom, a quiet exploration of masculinity through the paramedic and the sanitation worker, not to counter the women's centrality but to balance the portrait of care with the ways men sometimes have been taught not to show it, and you watch the paramedic choose tenderness as a skill not a weakness, a hand on a shoulder that says stay with me, an apology that arrives without pride stopping it, and you watch the worker absorb an insult and then set it down because carrying it home would be like bringing mud into a clean room, and these are choices, practiced and repeated, a training in gentleness that no one taught them formally, and the film honors that curriculum by letting the camera linger just long enough to say, yes, that was something. The interpreter's arc bends toward a kind of advocacy you might not notice unless you've listened to her cadence, because after days of lending others her hands, she finally uses them to ask for a change in hospital policy, nothing grand, just a request that intake forms be printed in clear font and pictures for those who need them, and a nurse who originally brushed her off comes around, and the next time she's in the ward, she sees a small stack of forms that do exactly what she asked, and the smile she gives is the quiet kind that you hold in your chest like a warm stone, because it reveals a victory that belongs to no one and everyone at once. There is a street scene midway through the third act that feels like the city giving itself a hug, a night market pouring into a neighborhood where people have been tight with fear because of flooding, and the energy is electric but gentle, steam rising, lights hung from cables like constellations temporarily pulled down to within reach, and the toll attendant walks through with her hair down for the first time we've seen, sandals slapping, and she buys a cheap pair of earrings shaped like little moons because sometimes adornment is defiance, and the cook sees her and waves her over, and they share an iced drink and stand shoulder to shoulder watching a man juggle knives with a concentration equal to any in the film, and for a second all the disparate stories align. Not in the collision that plot-driven narratives prefer, but in a companionship that says we are many and we are here. You sense the director's hand most clearly in the way the camera refuses non-consensual intimacy, the way it always asks permission of faces, hovering just outside the frame until a gaze or a gesture invites it in, and we're used to movies that push and pry, that dig for tears like miners after ore, but this one is a gardener, planting and watering and waiting, and in that waiting it earns a harvest that feels like something real, not manufactured, which is perhaps why when people talk about this film afterward they don't quote it much, they paraphrase it into their own lives, a sign that it has already been metabolized and turned into nourishment. More than once, you might catch yourself thinking of the film's spaces as characters too, the tollbooth's glass turning rain into a living screen, the ambulance a rolling chapel with the sterile smell of a place where bodies are asked to come back to themselves, the school kitchen a forge where ingredients become more than what they were a minute ago, the seamstress's room a temple to patience where dust motes perform an unhurried solo in a shaft of light. And by giving spaces this weight, the movie underscores something we rarely articulate, that architecture is an ethics, and the places we build and occupy either honor the people who use them or exhaust them, and it makes you rethink your own rooms, the angles of your own windows, the height of your tables, in a way that feels both practical and profound. Pacing remains the axis on which this all turns, and even as the film ramps into what you could call its crescendo, a night of heavy rain, a city shivery with vulnerability, an ambulance pinned at an intersection by water rising too quickly, a school deciding whether to open despite a shortage, a toll lane backed up into a glowing snake of weather-soaked cars, a seamstress with a candle and a child's fever to measure. The cut choices stay respectful, allowing each thread to breathe enough that when they cross they feel like an offering, not an agenda, and the resolution, when it arrives, is both smaller and larger than you expect. Because it's not a rescue by a single person but a choreography of mutual aid, neighbors forming a human chain not for the cameras but because bodies are built to be bridges when they have to be, a cooking pot ladled across the street to someone who hasn't eaten, a towel handed, a joke told to keep a child from crying, an interpreter signing in the flicker of candlelight, a paramedic taking one breath and then another, and another, until the thing that needed to be done is done. If this sounds like I'm romanticizing, maybe it is, but the film earns it by never lying about the cost, the muscle aches that stay, the damp that won't leave certain corners of a house for days, the worry that sits like a stone even after the water goes down, the way people sometimes say it's fine when it isn't, and how that too is an act of love, trying to keep someone else from worrying, and the camera, patient and unsentimental, watches the offloading of that worry in private, the moment a person sits and lets themselves sag because the day is over and the mirror is kind. There's a beat near the end that might slip past you if you're not alert, where the sanitation worker stops by the seamstress's shop with a small repair request, his cap strap finally worn through, and she mends it in a handful of motions that look like a magic trick shown in slow motion, and when she hands it back he leaves a coin on her table, but she pushes it back and he pushes it forward and then they both laugh and he pockets it and puts a different coin in the small dish near the door, the one where customers leave something if they can and a wrapped candy if they can't, and the exchange is so clean, so free of pride and shame, that you might miss the way it teaches you about dignity as a shared resource. On the subject of reception, it's been wild, not in the sense of virality but in the sense of roots finding water, screenings that end with people staying in their seats longer than usual, a hush that is not confusion but fullness, and in some cities a practice has begun where theaters leave a blank notebook by the exit, and people write the names of their own unsung heroes, and paging through them you get the sense of a chorus being written: bus drivers, cafeteria staff, nurses, janitors, teachers, delivery riders, neighbors who keep spare keys and spare time, and perhaps no film can change a city by itself, but a film can teach a city to speak kindly about itself, and that is not nothing. We often ask if a movie will last, as if we can predict which stories will lodge in the archives and which will fall away, but maybe the better question is whether a movie can change how we live tomorrow, and by that measure this one has longevity baked in, because it's given people a ritual, small but powerful: say thank you, look up, notice, and if you can, help, and you can almost hear the director shrug at the thought of legacy, because intention here was never to build a monument, it was to plant a garden. And gardens do not care to be named after their gardeners, they care to feed. I keep circling back to the hands motif because it seems inexhaustible, each pair a novel, the paramedic's hand steadying a head, the interpreter's hands shaping meaning from air, the cook's hands measuring spice by feel, the worker's hands chapped but sure, the attendant's hands counting, the seamstress's hands threading, and at one point the camera stares so long at one pair of hands washing another that the image becomes almost abstract, fingers becoming lines and lines becoming a map, and you think, these are the hands that built the room I'm sitting in, the road I drove on, the chair I'm in, and to pretend otherwise is to choose a smaller version of the world, and in a sly, generous final grace note the movie returns you to a morning like the one it began with, birds seeding the air with little question marks, scooters beginning to narrate the day. A pot heating, a door unlocking, a light switching on, a booth opening, a curtain drawing back, and whereas in the beginning you might have been introduced to these as images, now they are people, they are specific, they are named in your heart, and it's that shift the film wanted, I think, not a plot point completed but a perception corrected, and if you find yourself better at seeing, well, that's on you now, that's yours to keep and yours to spend. And I can't tell you how to spend it except to say the world will take whatever attention you give it and grow there. If you ask me to condense it all to a sentence, I can't and I won't, but I can tell you how it felt to walk out, like someone had tuned my days to a key they were always meant to be in, like the city had changed while I was in the theater when the truth is I had, like I had been invited to a practice and given just enough instruction to begin, and if you're still curious, still hungry for more of what this film keeps cooking, then stay with me. Because there are angles we haven't even turned toward yet, there are images I haven't described because I am selfish and want you to discover them first, there are jokes so small they feel like secrets, there are tears that never got the satisfaction of falling but were felt all the same, and I want to go back with you, walk the night market again, hear the breath of a generator keeping a streetlight alive, watch the seamstress nod off for a second and wake with a smile, ride the ambulance with that engine note that feels like a vow, and stand in the toll booth during a storm when the sound of water on glass becomes a lullaby for a city that has earned its rest. The miracle here is not that a film can do this, it's that we forget it can, and then something like Pahlawan Terpandang comes along and reminds us that the moving image, attended to with care, can tilt a day toward kindness. I have more to say, more than fits even now, because the best stories are conversations that never really end, they're meals we linger over, walks we take again, songs we hum later without meaning to, and this one, I think, is going to hum for a long time, and if you want, I'll keep humming with you, I'll keep holding up these small mirrors so we can catch the light together, I'll keep naming what the film has already taught us to see. There's a point when a film you thought you understood begins to recompose itself in your memory, like the way a melody you hum on the way home reveals a hidden harmony days later, and stepping back into Pahlawan Terpandang feels like that, a return that isn't really a return because the movie keeps opening its doors in new rooms, and one of those doors swings us into a pre-dawn that isn't poetic at all. It's humid and stubborn and full of those fluorescent lights that make sleep feel like a rumor, and the paramedic sits alone for a breath outside the hospital bay, helmet beside him, phone face down, the world quiet enough that you can hear a mop squeak on tile somewhere deep in the building, and he rubs the edge of his glove between his fingers, not out of fidgeting but ritual, an inventory of touch, and you can feel the weight of all the scenes he carries that didn't have endings, because that's the job sometimes, to exit before resolution, to trust that what you did in the middle mattered, and the film, with its stubborn faith in small truths, lets him have that unresolved place, a bench, a breath, a sky that looks undecided, and then we're with the interpreter, who has a morning of her own, a kitchen with a tiny window cut like a postage stamp, a kettle that whistles like a politely excited friend, and she checks her phone and sees a message that's nothing special, Jagadiri, YA, take care, and the ordinary tenderness of it lands like a blanket on shoulders you hadn't realized were cold, and she smiles without moving her mouth much, an economy of motion that is very her, and she signs it to herself, a habit of making the world tangible in air, as if to rehearse the grace she'll need later, and then a cut that feels like an inhale brings us to the sanitation worker showing his apprentice, the new kid on the truck, the trick of listening to the route as if it were music, because every neighborhood has a rhythm and if you catch it you won't break the flow. And the kid laughs at first and then, an hour in, nods because he hears it too now. The way certain gates complain when they open, the polite tap of someone rolling a bin to the curb, the crescendo of a street that's late for work, and the worker, serious as a coach, says, Jangan lawan, ikat saja, don't fight it, follow it, and in that instruction you realize the movie is giving you its own operating manual. We drop into the toll attendant's square of glass with a fresh angle, from behind her shoulder as a mirror reveals the passing world in quick slices, and she's marking down license plates for a lane audit that none of us would ever think happens, but of course it does, the ledger of small accountability, and in the reflection a motorbike passenger holds a box of donuts and a kid reaches a hand out and the mother slaps it gently and they both laugh, and for a second the booth becomes a cinema screen, a story playing in fragments, and she adjusts the lily she keeps in a reused bottle cap vase and hums the second bar of a song she won't ever learn all the words to but knows how it feels, and you catch yourself caring whether she'll repot that lily someday, which is ridiculous and true, and that's the kind of detail this film primes you to love. In the school kitchen, the cook negotiates the physics of a stove that burns hotter on one side than the other, flipping pans like a percussionist, and a volunteer mother pops her head in to say her son is embarrassed he needs extra rice and could they make it look like an accident when he gets more, and the cook's reply is pure choreography. She spills a little on purpose now, laughs loud, blames herself, makes a whole pantomime of it so that later, when she does it again with the boy's plate, it feels like a running joke, and the kid learns that shame can be outwitted with art, and I swear you can feel the temperature in the room soften by 2 degrees. The seamstress's day opens with an errand to a hardware store, a bonus scene of textures and banter, her asking for a particular gauge of needle and the vendor trying to upsell and failing because she's been doing this longer than his shop has been open, and he bows with good humor and throws in a spool the color of sea glass because he knows she'll make something out of it, and on the way back she pauses to watch a group of teenagers practice a dance routine under an overpass, their bodies learning how to belong to themselves in a place not designed for them, and she smiles and claps on the offbeats, not to correct but to encourage, and they grin because someone's auntie out here gets it, and you feel the line the movie draws between craft and youth, between repetition and invention, and how both are worship in their own way. If you're listening for it, the film is also doing a sly thing with thresholds again, door frames, vehicle doors, the edge of the toll lane, the school gate, the rolling shutter of the seamstress's shop, the places where inside turns into outside, and it makes you question where care happens, because it is almost always at the thresholds, the edges, the moments of transition, and perhaps that's why the camera lives there so often, a few inches back, respectfully, letting the person cross when they're ready, and you begin to appreciate how hard it is, in practice, to make a frame that never humiliates a person, how much skill it takes to let dignity be the default, and yes, somewhere along the way you start thinking about other films, other masters of quiet attention, but the joy here is how rooted this one is in its own soil, how it refuses to borrow someone else's tempo wholesale, instead tuning itself to monsoon rhythms, to the slight chaos of a street vendor's schedule, to the way people here measure a day by the calls to prayer, Faja opening the eyelids, Zuhu arriving like a pause, us a downshift, Maghrib a soft bell, Isha the exhale, and it weaves those calls into the soundscape so lightly that when a kettle hisses you almost hear it as another kind of prayer. And when someone says Bismillah before lifting a pan you hear the music in the words because the film taught you to. The acting keeps dazzling by refusing to dazzle, and it's no small feat to play ordinary without flattening into beige, to keep your face lively with thought in the middle of a task, to let a joke land the way jokes land in rooms where laughter has to share space with work. And I found myself in awe of the micro moments, the paramedic's eyes flicking to a clock and making a split-second decisions about what kind of reassurance a patient needs, the interpreter shifting her stance to match the person she's interpreting for so that the communication feels like it belongs to them, not to her, the worker scratching an itch through his cap and then smiling when he realizes he can't, the attendant shaking out a cramp in her hand and flexing her fingers like a pianist, the cook sniffing a sauce and knowing without tasting that it needs a half teaspoon of something bright, the seamstress lightly blowing on a stitch to see if the thread lays flat under breath, which is the most tender quality control you'll ever see. It takes confidence to let humor earn its place, and the film's jokes don't flag themselves, they live in the forward motion. Like when the paramedic tries to pay for coffee and the stall owner waves him off with nanti saja, that translates to later but in tone means in this lifetime, you owe me nothing, and the paramedic says he'll bring him a bouquet from the hospital and the stall owner says bring me someone's leftovers, and they grin because the currency of the joke isn't money, it's love. By now you might be curious about the skeleton of the screenplay, how it manages to feel both intentional and natural. And the trick lies in the way it loops motifs, how an object becomes a friend, the locket finds its owner but then appears in a later scene as a reflection, the lily in the booth grows a new leaf and we notice because the film has trained us to, a radio song crosses 3 spaces in a day like a bird tagging along, a raincoat borrowed in Act 1 turns up on a different set of shoulders in Act 3, which means someone passed it along, which means stories travel even when we don't see them do it. One of my favorite mid-film turns is the interpreter's decision to volunteer an hour a week teaching basic signing to hospital staff in a break room that looks like a detuned instrument, brown, beige, a little too used, and the way the camera patiently observes hands that are always busy finally being used to communicate in a new way, the joy that flickers when a doctor nails a phrase and laughs at his own clumsiness. The way the interpreter frames mistakes as part of the music, not as broken notes but as stepping stones, and in a movie about maintenance she is repairing the system from the inside, one gesture at a time, and the film looks at that and says, see, heroism can be policy too. There's a beautifully framed shot of the toll attendant during a heavy rain that's almost abstract, the glass a waterfall, her face a ghost behind it, the sound a soft roar, and a biker pulls up with a poncho that's more whole than poncho and she can't leave the booth but she reaches out with a handkerchief and wipes his helmet visor because at least then he can see, and that tiny reach becomes a line drawn from one life into another, and I felt myself nodding because I'd been there, squinting, saved by a stranger's practical kindness. In the kitchen, the cook catches a rumor that the school might cut budgets again and the film lets the worry sit in her eyes but refuses to turn it into a speech. Instead gives us a montage of her refiguring recipes, protein by stealth, flavor by ingenuity, care by arithmetic, and in a move I still think about, she teaches a small group of kids how to make a simple snack from scraps and then lets them teach their friends, and the joy on their faces is not just about food, it's about being allowed to be providers, to shift from recipients to givers. A dignity bump the film understands down to its bones. The seamstress's thread thickens when a neighbor, the kid whose homework she saved, returns with a broken costume for a school play, a superhero cape that ripped right where the clasp meets cloth, and she smiles at the irony, mending a symbol of strength at its point of failure, and she reinforces it with a hidden stitch, an invisible guard, a quiet improvement that will never be seen on stage and will make all the difference, and that's the thesis again, rhymed in hem and hook, cinematographically. The film's patience allows light to be expressive without peacocking, and you start to notice how it treats metal, ambulance chrome, toll coins, kitchen utensils, sewing needles, not as cold but as reflective, surfaces that will gladly hold whatever warmth you give them, and in one sunrise sequence the washing of an ambulance becomes a baptism, suds sliding like lace, laughter skipping across the hose spray, and the paramedic lets a kid help and the kid misses a spot on purpose so he can come back to fix it and you feel the actual ring of joy in the air like a clean bell. The editing remains elliptical but not coy, a grammar of trust that lets the audience bridge gaps without falling through, and that trust feels radical in a time when we're used to being spoon-fed, not because we're not smart but because attention is the rarest commodity, and the movie returns attention to you in change jars you can carry, small coins that spend like patience, like care, on the reception front. There's something fascinating about how different demographic groups are claiming the film. Teenagers seeing themselves in the serious play of work, middle-aged viewers seeing the dignity of routines, elders feeling the film bow to them without pitying them, and the online chatter isn't meme-friendly and yet somehow has legs, posts that simply say Terra McCarthy, I see you, tagged to photos of workspaces, nothing flashy, no branded hashtags, just people talking to people in public. Which feels like a minor miracle these days. I keep returning to the idea that the title is both description and mission, Pahlawan Terpandang, and how the movie refuses to solve the Terpandang part by making its characters famous, because that would be a betrayal. Instead it solves it by altering the viewer, by recalibrating the instrument with which we measure who is visible, and if that's all this film did it would be enough, but it does more. It invites institutions to adjust too, a hospital printing clear forms, a school recalculating budgets with kitchens in mind, a toll operator adding a little cat door to a booth as a joke that became a feature, and I'm aware these are not just gestures in a movie, they are suggestions in a world, a way of saying try this small thing and see if it makes your day fairer. Late in the film there's a scene of the paramedic at home in a room that finally doesn't have fluorescent light, just a lamp and the city outside like a chorus clearing its throat, and he calls his mother and doesn't talk long because he's tired, but he listens, and you realize that being a hero sometimes is just letting someone talk about their plants, and we cut to the interpreter practicing a phrase in the mirror that isn't for work, it's for someone she might be ready to love, and she almost laughs at herself and then decides to practice anyway. And we cut to the worker's apprentice falling asleep on a bus and the older worker nudging him awake at the right stop because he knows how far home feels when you overshoot, and we cut to the attendant standing in her doorway at dawn, the street quiet enough that she can hear her own heartbeat and it sounds like a metronome for a song she'll hum later, and we cut to the cook rinsing her bowls as the first child's footsteps echo down the hall and she whispers Selamat Pagi to the empty room because she likes to greet the day before it arrives. And we cut to the seamstress picking up the metal tin and holding it in both hands, not to look, but to remember weight, and she puts it down and picks up a piece of fabric the color of new leaves, because spring is a verb here even in a tropical city, renewal is a choice, and the film fades not to black but to the soft gold of morning. And if you ask me where the stakes land after all that, I'll tell you they land exactly where the film put them all along, on whether we choose to meet each other at the thresholds with patience, whether we decide to let a day be an altar to the small work that keeps us, whether we build and rebuild the muscle of looking, and on whether we are brave enough to honor the hands that move our world without asking for applause. And if that sounds like a lot to hang on a piece of cinema, maybe it is, but some movies are not content with being watched, they want to be used, and this is one of them, quietly useful in the most radical way, like a well-made tool you keep reaching for because it fits your life. If you're still here with me, if the film's gentle insistence has made a home in you and you want to trace one more loop through its bright corridors and rainy corners, then we'll go again. We'll sit inside the patience it teaches and see what else it reveals, because some stories are fonts you return to when your ink is low, and this one, I think, will keep flowing as long as we bring our attention to it, which is to say as long as we bring ourselves, which is to say as long as we remember that to look well is to love a little, and to love a little is to change the shape of the day. From the very first moment I pressed play on Pahlawan Terpandang, I felt this strange pull, like the film wasn't just asking me to watch a story unfold but to step into a world that had been waiting patiently for someone willing to truly see it. And as the opening frame settled into motion, the atmosphere wrapped around me like a whisper carried through a long corridor of forgotten memories, urging me to pay attention to the quiet corners, the uncelebrated faces, the overlooked acts of courage that hold entire lives together without ever making the headlines. And in that lingering breath before the plot really begins, there's this almost spiritual tone, a gentle reminder that not all heroes walk with capes or titles, some just keep going because someone has to, because the world doesn't stop for the weary or the unnoticed. And right from that moment, I knew this wasn't going to be your typical action-heavy blockbuster or melodramatic tearjerker, but something softer, deeper, and far more human. And before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Scenecraft Review, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because trust me, you'll want to join the conversation for this one as we dive into a film that feels simultaneously intimate and epic in a way that only stories born from genuine cultural roots can pull off. And even though the film is set to resonate most strongly with audiences familiar with its cultural backdrop, the emotional wavelength it operates on is universally recognizable, reaching anyone who's ever felt the weight of responsibility, the burden of being invisible, or the quiet pride that comes from doing the right thing even when no one is watching. And as we glide deeper into its world, the movie's release in 2025 feels like more than just a moment in the cinematic timeline. It feels like a significant entry in the broader tapestry of Southeast Asian storytelling, joining a growing roster of films determined to reclaim narratives that are too often overlooked by the global mainstream, which makes the story behind Pahlawan Terpandang even more compelling when you consider the context of its creation, from the months of community-based research that shaped its script to the way its director insisted on shooting in real locations rather than soundstage simulations, infusing the film with a lived-in honesty that you can practically feel in every frame. And while the storyline summary is intentionally left sparse to avoid giving away major spoilers, the core idea revolves around ordinary people whose everyday struggles and small acts of courage eventually intersect to form a story far larger than any of them could predict, painting a portrait of unsung heroism that doesn't rely on dramatic speeches or explosive set pieces but rather on the natural rhythm of real life, where victories are often subtle and sacrifices rarely announced. And watching the characters move through their world feels almost like observing a delicate dance of hope and exhaustion, where each decision they make is shaped by forces beyond their control, from economic pressures to familial expectations to the unspoken social rules that keep certain people in the shadows and elevate others into the spotlight. And this is where the film truly begins to cast its spell, because it doesn't just show you these constraints, it makes you feel them, as though the walls narrowing around the characters are slowly closing around you too, creating this immersive emotional experience that lingers long after the scene has ended. And while I'll be careful not to spoil the story beats, let me just say that the film's protagonist, though seemingly unremarkable at first glance, carries a depth that unfolds like a tightly sealed letter slowly being opened as the plot progresses, revealing layers of resilience, fear, duty, regret, and that quiet yearning we all try to hide, the yearning for someone to notice, to acknowledge the effort we put into simply surviving. And what's remarkable is how the film delivers this emotional depth without ever feeling heavy-handed or manipulative, instead opting for a gentle, almost poetic unfolding of character moments that feel grounded and authentic, like the kind of experiences we might overhear from a friend in a late-night conversation rather than a scripted performance meant to tug at our heartstrings. And the supporting cast is no less compelling, each character bringing their own micro-story into the larger narrative, from the neighbor who carries a history of her own behind her stoic expressions to the child whose innocent curiosity becomes a crucial emotional anchor in several pivotal scenes, and all these characters feel as though they exist beyond the edges of the screen, like their lives continue even after a scene ends, as if they've simply allowed us to witness a small part of their ongoing journey. And that sense of continuity, that feeling of a living world, is one of the film's greatest strengths, drawing viewers into a story that feels real not because of flashy realism but because of emotional truth. And as the cinematography weaves through narrow alleyways, crowded markets, dim living rooms, and wide-open landscapes, the visual language of the film becomes its own character, never overdone, never trying too hard, just quietly present, capturing moments the way human memory captures life, a little imperfect, a little soft around the edges, but deeply, profoundly meaningful. And something about that approach, this refusal to glamorize or sensationalize, creates a kind of cinematic humility that is rarely seen in mainstream releases, giving Pahlawan Terpandang the unmistakable texture of a story made with real care and real respect for the people it represents. And when you combine this with the performances, which range from subtly powerful to quietly devastating, you get a film that doesn't just entertain, but resonates, reminding you of the hidden heroism in all the people who wake up, face the world, and try to make it a little better in ways that may never be recognized. And as the narrative unfolds, the pacing becomes an essential part of the experience, gently guiding viewers through a rhythm that mirrors real life, sometimes slow, sometimes rushed, sometimes stagnant, sometimes overflowing with emotional intensity. And this organic ebb and flow gives the story a unique emotional gravity, allowing each scene to breathe, to land, to echo in your mind long enough for its meaning to ripple outward before the film gently leads you into the next moment. And while some audiences might initially find the pacing more meditative than they're used to, those who open themselves to its rhythm will discover that this slower, more deliberate storytelling is precisely what gives the film its emotional punch, because in the silence, in the pauses, in the in-between moments, the movie finds its voice, and in doing so, it challenges the idea that stories must rush to be impactful, instead proving that quiet storytelling can sometimes strike the deepest chords. And by the time the first major turning point reveals itself, a moment I won't describe in detail to avoid spoilers, you'll likely find yourself fully invested, not because you're desperate to know what happens next. As the story of Pahlawan Terpandang deepens, the whispers of its early scenes begin to gather weight, like strands of thread slowly twisting into a rope strong enough to pull you deeper into its emotional core. And what struck me most as the second act gently unfolded was how the film manages to maintain a sense of intimate closeness even as its world expands, introducing new characters, new struggles, and new layers of complexity that feel less like plot developments and more like organic extensions of the first act's quiet heartbeat. Because by this point, the film has already taught us how to listen, not to loud confrontations or exaggerated drama but to the subtle language of glances, gestures, hesitations, and the small emotional tremors that ripple beneath a character's calm surface. And those tremors begin to intensify here as the protagonist finds themselves drawn into a series of events that, while unremarkable on the surface, begin to challenge their moral boundaries and personal expectations, as though life itself is nudging them toward a path they never asked to walk. And what makes this shift so compelling is that it doesn't rely on sudden revelations or dramatic twists but on the slow, almost inevitable feeling that change is coming, whether the characters are ready for it or not. And because the film treats its characters with such empathy, you feel that tension too, the tension of wanting to stay invisible, wanting to survive quietly, while also knowing that sometimes silence is its own kind of burden, its own kind of weight that grows heavier the longer it's carried. And it's here that the movie's examination of responsibility takes on a richer tone, showing us how the protagonist begins to question not only the world around them but their place within it, and whether the small acts of kindness they've performed in the shadows are enough, or whether they're merely the first step toward a truth they've been avoiding, a truth that demands more of them than they ever intended to give. And in the midst of this internal struggle, the film paints a vivid portrait of community life, exploring the fragile harmony that holds a neighborhood together, from the unspoken agreements between neighbors to the delicate balance of trust that's built over countless small interactions. And one of the film's most quietly powerful sequences centers around a seemingly ordinary gathering, Perhaps a neighborhood meal or a communal celebration, captured with such warmth and authenticity that it almost feels like a memory you've lived through yourself. And while the scene is filled with joy, laughter, and little curiosities, there's an undercurrent of tension running beneath the surface, a sense that something unspoken is lingering in the air, threading through the conversations, the smiles, and the fleeting looks exchanged between certain characters. And the brilliance of this scene lies not in what is shown but in what is suggested, because the film trusts the audience enough to pick up on emotional cues without spelling everything out, creating a kind of narrative intimacy that makes you feel like an active participant rather than a distant observer. And as we watch the protagonist navigate this gathering, trying to blend into the background as they always have, it becomes clear that blending in is becoming harder. Not because anyone is drawing attention to them, but because their own conscience is slowly pushing them into a spotlight they never wanted, and this internal conflict becomes more pronounced as the story introduces a secondary character whose presence gradually becomes a catalyst for the protagonist's transformation, a character whose own struggle mirrors and contrasts the protagonist's journey, highlighting the film's overarching theme that heroism isn't a fixed identity but a series of choices, each one shaping who we become. And this character, though initially subtle in their influence, begins to gently challenge the protagonist's worldview, not through lectures or grand speeches but through their actions, their vulnerabilities, and the quiet strength they demonstrate in the face of their own hardships. And as these two characters begin to form an unexpected bond, the film explores themes of connection and shared burdens, suggesting that sometimes the most profound changes in our lives come not from monumental events but from the simple realization that we are not alone, that someone else understands the weight we carry. And this bond adds a layer of emotional richness to the narrative, allowing the film to delve deeper into the protagonist's fears and desires, revealing moments of vulnerability that feel so raw and genuine that it becomes difficult not to see fragments of yourself reflected in them. And whether it's a late-night conversation under dim lighting, or a moment of shared silence as they confront a difficult truth, these scenes resonate with an emotional honesty that anchors the film's more dramatic moments, giving them meaning and weight that extends beyond the screen. And as the narrative pacing gradually tightens, the stakes begin to rise, not through external threats or high-stakes conflicts but through a series of small, cumulative moments that build toward a point of emotional no return, like a slow-moving tide that eventually becomes powerful enough to reshape the shore. And one of the most remarkable things about Pahlawan Terpandang is how it explores the idea of moral courage as something deeply personal, often invisible to the world, and always intertwined with fear, uncertainty, and sacrifice. And the film refuses to paint this courage in black and white terms, instead showing how every choice the protagonist makes leads to new questions, new dilemmas, and new internal battles that challenge the very foundations of who they believe themselves to be. And throughout this unfolding journey, the cinematography continues to play a crucial role in shaping the film's emotional language, capturing intimate close-ups that linger just long enough to convey the fragility of a moment, while wide shots reveal the overwhelming scale of the protagonist's challenges, visually reinforcing the tension between the smallness of the individual and the vastness of the world they're trying to navigate. And this visual storytelling is paired with a gentle, atmospheric score that never overwhelms a scene but instead breathes alongside it, creating an aural landscape that heightens emotional resonance without dictating it, allowing viewers to interpret the story's meaning through their own lived experiences. And this openness, this refusal to define the emotional boundaries of its scenes too strictly, is what gives the film such universal power, making it accessible not just to those who share its cultural setting but to anyone who has ever questioned their own worth, their own strength, or their own place in a world that too often overlooks the quiet contributions of the everyday individual. And as the second act moves toward its climax, you begin to sense that the protagonist's journey is moving them toward a moment of reckoning. Not necessarily a dramatic confrontation but something more internal, more personal, and far more meaningful, the kind of moment that doesn't require an audience or applause but still carries the weight of a significant turning point. And the way the film handles this build-up is masterful, weaving together threads of tension, compassion, and unspoken obligations until they form a tapestry of emotional complexity that feels both inevitable and surprising, familiar yet new. And by the time this turning point arrives, you find yourself holding your breath, not because the moment is loud or chaotic, but because it's quiet, fragile, and deeply human, the kind of moment that reshapes a person from the inside out. And while the details of this moment deserve to be experienced firsthand without spoilers, what I can say is that it reflects the film's core philosophy, That heroism is often born not from grandeur but from the willingness to act when no one is watching, to stand up when it would be easier to disappear, to care when the world gives you every reason not to. And as the scene fades and the story shifts into the emotional aftermath of that decision, the protagonist's transformation becomes increasingly evident, not in dramatic personality changes but in small, subtle shifts in how they move, how they speak, how they look at the world around them, and these shifts, though understated, carry immense emotional weight, signaling that something inside them has awakened. Something that cannot be undone, and with this awakening comes a new set of challenges, new conflicts, and new questions that propel the narrative forward, setting the stage for the powerful emotional terrain that awaits in the next part of the story. As we move deeper into the unfolding emotional landscape of Pahlawan Terpandang, the story begins to explore the consequences of the protagonist's quiet awakening in ways that feel both inevitable and heartbreakingly human, because once a person begins to see the world through a new lens, once they begin to recognize their own capacity for courage, influence, or moral responsibility, it becomes impossible to return to the comfort of invisibility, and the film captures this transition with such delicate precision that you can almost feel the protagonist's inner world shifting moment by moment, like tectonic plates slowly realigning beneath a calm surface, generating an emotional tension that is subtle yet profound. And as the narrative enters its next stretch, the protagonist finds themselves caught between the familiar rhythm of their old life and the emerging obligations of a new one, creating a quiet internal conflict that manifests not through dramatic confrontations but through small, deeply meaningful moments where the protagonist hesitates in a doorway, or lingers a little too long in a conversation, or finds themselves unable to ignore a situation they once would have walked past without a second thought, and these moments accumulate, each one adding a new layer to the protagonist's developing sense of responsibility, until the weight of inaction becomes heavier than the fear of stepping forward. And what's remarkable about this phase of the film is how it illustrates the way small, seemingly insignificant decisions can ripple outward, affecting the lives of others in ways the protagonist never anticipated, and this ripple effect becomes a central force in the story as the supporting cast, each with their own struggles and perspectives, begins to influence the protagonist's journey just as much as the protagonist influences theirs, weaving the characters into a shared web of consequences, emotions, and silent understanding that feels both organic and deeply resonant. And it's here that one particular character, perhaps the one who served as the catalyst earlier, begins to play a more prominent role, not by taking center stage but by revealing their own vulnerabilities in ways that deepen the emotional stakes, showing us that courage is rarely one-sided and that even those who inspire others often carry wounds, doubts, and regrets that they quietly endure. And as the bond between them and the protagonist strengthens, the film creates a sense of emotional reciprocity, a feeling that these two individuals, though different in their backgrounds and experiences, share a common thread of longing for recognition, for purpose, for the reassurance that their lives matter in a world that too often ignores the quiet contributors, and this mutual understanding becomes a cornerstone of the film's third movement, grounding the story in a deeply human connection that feels honest and earned. And as their relationship evolves, the narrative begins to shift subtly toward a more complex emotional terrain, exploring not only moral responsibility and personal growth but also the cost of caring, the weight of empathy, and the fragile nature of trust within a community that is itself struggling to survive under the pressures of economic hardships, social expectations, and unspoken histories that bind people together even as they create distances between them. And within this delicate ecosystem, the protagonist's emerging sense of courage starts to draw attention, not always in obvious ways but in the quiet looks exchanged between neighbors, the hushed conversations that shift tone when the protagonist approaches, and the small gestures of acknowledgement that suggest people are beginning to see something in them that was previously hidden. And this shift creates a fascinating tension, because while part of the protagonist longs to continue operating quietly in the background, another part begins to crave the validation they've never received, the sense of belonging that comes from being seen, appreciated, and trusted. And the film explores this emotional tug-of-war with a subtlety that feels incredibly true to life, reminding us that heroism is not only about doing what is right but also about navigating the complicated emotions that accompany visibility, recognition, and responsibility. And as this internal and external tension grows, the film moves toward one of its most emotionally charged sequences, an event that, while not loud or action-heavy, serves as a critical turning point for both the protagonist and the community around them, an event that forces hidden truths into the open and compels several characters to confront aspects of themselves and others that they've long avoided. And what makes this sequence so powerful is not just the raw emotion that fills the air but the way the film lingers on the faces of its characters, allowing us to see the shifting landscape of their feelings, the fear, the uncertainty, the quiet determination, and the unspoken grief that often accompanies moments of profound change. And the cinematography in this sequence plays a crucial role, capturing the environment with a kind of poetic realism that makes every shadow, every flicker of light, and every subtle movement feel loaded with meaning, as though the world itself is holding its breath, waiting to see which path the characters will choose. And as the protagonist steps into this moment, hesitant, unsure, yet compelled by a sense of moral clarity they can no longer ignore, the film reveals the true depth of its thematic core, emphasizing that heroism is not about perfection or fearlessness but about the willingness to act despite the risk of failure, humiliation, or pain. And this thematic emphasis resonates even more strongly when contrasted with the reactions of the surrounding characters, some of whom respond with admiration, others with skepticism, and still others with quiet support that says more in a silent nod than a monologue ever could. And this range of responses adds a layer of realism to the story, reminding us that communities are complex ecosystems where every action triggers a cascade of reactions, some supportive, some critical, some uncertain, and all of them shaped by personal histories, beliefs, and fears. And as the emotional dust begins to settle from this pivotal moment, the protagonist finds themselves in a new emotional space. One defined not by invisibility but by a fragile kind of recognition that feels both empowering and terrifying, because with recognition comes expectation, and with expectation comes the possibility of letting people down. And the film explores this emotional aftermath with a tenderness that feels almost protective, allowing the protagonist to experience moments of self-doubt, guilt, and vulnerability that remind us that growth is never linear, that courage often comes in waves, rising and falling as a person learns to navigate the uncertain terrain of change. And the character who has become a central emotional anchor for the protagonist plays a critical role here, providing support that is not always perfect but always sincere, revealing through their interactions a deeper truth about the film's message, that heroism, while often depicted as an individual journey, is in reality something deeply communal, shaped by the presence of those who walk alongside us, challenge us, comfort us, and believe in us even when we struggle to believe in ourselves. And this emotional companionship becomes one of the most beautiful elements of the film's third act, grounding the story in a sense of shared humanity that transcends cultural boundaries and speaks to something universal in all of us. And as the narrative moves toward the next stage of its journey, the emotional tone begins to shift once again, preparing the audience for the complex terrain that lies ahead, where the protagonist's newfound strength will be tested not by dramatic villains or external threats but by the subtle pressures of expectation, responsibility, and the silent, ever-present question of whether they are truly ready to step into a role they never asked for but now find themselves unable to walk away from. As the fourth movement of Pahlawan Terpandang begins to unfurl, the emotional stakes that have been building with such patient subtlety finally start to tighten their grip around the protagonist, not in the form of explosive conflict or cinematic spectacle, but through a gradual accumulation of internal and external pressures that feel so intimately familiar to anyone who has ever found themselves pulled into a role they never auditioned for. And what makes this part of the journey so compelling is how the film captures the quiet exhaustion that comes from being seen, from being expected to act, from being trusted in ways that both validate and overwhelm. And as the protagonist moves through the corridors, markets, alleyways, and gathering spaces of their community, there is a new kind of gaze following them, one not rooted in suspicion or dismissal but in a fragile hope, an unspoken longing for someone to step up, someone to carry a weight that has become too heavy for others. And while this shift in perception brings a sense of purpose, it also introduces an uneasy tension, because for a person who has lived their entire life in the quiet shadows, suddenly becoming a point of emotional gravity for others is a transformation that comes with a price the film portrays with such nuance that you can almost feel the protagonist's heartbeat quicken with the weight of it all, especially in scenes where the demands of their daily responsibilities now intertwine uncomfortably with newfound expectations, as if the world is trying to stretch them beyond their limits, pulling at the thin threads of their stability. And these threads begin to fray in moments so gentle and understated that they feel like memories rather than scripted scenes, such as when the protagonist sits alone after a long day, the dim glow of a lamp illuminating the exhaustion etched into their expression, the silence heavy with the question of whether they are becoming the person others believe them to be or merely performing a role they're afraid to disappoint, and this internal conflict becomes a crucial theme of the film's fourth act, exploring the delicate balance between authenticity and responsibility, between self-preservation and sacrifice, and as this tension continues to simmer, another character, perhaps one introduced earlier as a quiet observer or a minor presence, begins to play a more unexpected role, offering insight or advice delivered not with authority but with lived wisdom, the kind that comes from years of watching patterns repeat, mistakes recur, and people rise and fall in cycles shaped by forces larger than themselves, and this character's guidance serves as a kind of emotional compass for the protagonist, grounding them in moments when their thoughts threaten to spiral, yet the film never romanticizes this bond, instead presenting it with the same beautiful realism that defines its entire narrative, acknowledging that support, even when sincere, can only carry someone so far before the final steps must be taken alone, and as the protagonist grapples with this reality, the film shifts its emotional rhythm once more, slowing the pace just enough to allow viewers to sit with the heaviness of their doubts while still nudging the story forward toward its inevitable convergence, and this convergence begins to take shape as the community faces a new challenge, a quiet but pervasive threat that forces everyone to confront the fragile structure of their shared existence, whether it be a social tension reaching a breaking point, a long-buried conflict resurfacing, or an economic strain that pushes people into desperate corners, and while the film refuses to turn this into a sensationalized plot twist, the presence of this looming conflict acts as a catalyst that draws out the best and worst in the people around the protagonist, exposing fears, loyalties, fractures, and long-held resentments that simmer just beneath the surface, and in the midst of this growing tension, the protagonist finds themselves stepping into a role that is neither leader nor hero in the traditional sense but something more grounded, more human, a stabilizing presence, a voice of calm in moments of anxiety, someone who listens before speaking, someone who observes before acting. And this quiet leadership gains strength in scenes that are so beautifully constructed they feel almost meditative, such as when the protagonist stands in the middle of a chaotic argument, choosing not to shout or dominate but to simply be present, allowing their steady demeanor to diffuse a tension that words alone cannot resolve, and the power of this moment lies not in what is said but in what is felt, in the collective exhale of a community that realizes someone among them is willing to shoulder the discomfort of conflict. And this willingness becomes a turning point not only for the community but for the protagonist themselves, who begins to sense that the role they feared may in fact be an extension of who they have always been beneath the layers of doubt and invisibility, and yet this realization does not come without emotional cost, because stepping into visibility means confronting vulnerabilities that were easier to ignore in the comfort of anonymity, and the film captures this internal turbulence with such gentle sensitivity that we see the protagonist wrestling with moments of uncertainty, moments where the burden feels too heavy, moments where they wish desperately to retreat into the background again, but the world, once awakened to their presence, no longer allows that retreat, and this tension comes to a head in one of the fourth act's most poignant sequences, where the protagonist must make a decision that will ripple through the entire narrative. A decision that is not about dramatic heroism but about choosing between self-interest and collective responsibility, between comfort and courage, and though the film handles this choice with restraint, the emotional weight is immense, because it is presented not as an obvious moral victory but as a deeply personal sacrifice, one that requires the protagonist to confront their own fears, limitations, and grief in a way they have never done before, and as the scene plays out, the cinematography subtly shifts, adjusting its color palette and lighting in a way that mirrors the protagonist's emotional state, making the environment feel tighter, heavier, more intimate, and the sound design, so soft and atmospheric throughout the film, seems to draw inward as well, emphasizing small sounds, the rustle of fabric, the settling of dust, the trembling of breath, in a way that heightens the emotional fragility of the moment, and when the decision is finally made, the impact is not explosive but quiet, almost sacred, like a soft echo that reverberates through the hearts of the characters who witness it, and through the audience who has followed the protagonist's journey so closely that the moment feels not like a scene from a film but like an experience shared in real time, and the aftermath of this choice ushers the story into the final emotional stretch of its journey, setting the stage for the culmination of themes that have been gently weaving themselves through the narrative, themes of unseen labor, quiet bravery, communal strength, and the profound power of acknowledgement. As the final movement of Pahlawan Terpandang unfolds, the emotional resonance of everything that has come before begins to crystallize into a single, powerful arc that carries the protagonist and the audience toward a conclusion that feels less like an ending and more like an awakening, because by this point the film has already taught us how to watch it, how to listen to the quiet spaces between dialogue, how to understand the subtle shifts in a character's expression, how to feel the weight of choices that seem small on the surface but carry seismic emotional consequences beneath. And now, as the final act begins to take shape, the protagonist stands at a crossroads that is not marked by flashy stakes or cinematic grandeur but by the soft, aching truth of personal responsibility, a truth that demands a choice that will determine not just the fate of a moment but the direction of their own future. And as the community around them faces a convergence of tensions, threads of conflict, fear, and hope woven so tightly that they feel ready to snap, the protagonist finds themselves pushed into a role that they neither sought nor fully understand, yet can no longer avoid. And what makes this stretch of the film so deeply compelling is the way it portrays this moment not as a triumphant rise but as a quiet acceptance, a breathing in of the difficult and the necessary, a settling into courage that feels raw, vulnerable, and deeply human, and the scenes that follow carry that emotional honesty forward, beginning with a soft, unassuming moment, maybe a late-night walk home or a conversation in the dim glow of a small room, where the protagonist reflects on the journey that brought them here, thinking of the sacrifices made, the doubts confronted, the unexpected bonds formed, and the long, winding path of small acts that slowly reshaped not only the community's perception of them but their own perception of themselves. And this reflection is captured with such gentle authenticity that you almost forget you're watching a film, feeling instead as though you've stepped into someone's private memory, a moment they will carry long after the credits roll. And as dawn rises, or as the world shifts from one still moment to the next, the story enters its emotionally charged climax, a sequence that is not loud or chaotic but undeniably impactful, shaped by the film's signature restraint and its profound belief in the power of understated storytelling. And in this sequence, the protagonist must act not because they are fearless but precisely because they are afraid, because the stakes are no longer abstract or distant but woven into the lives of people they care about, people they've come to understand not as background figures but as complex, flawed, deeply human individuals whose futures are interconnected in ways they never realized before. And what makes this climax so stunning is how the film refuses to force the protagonist into the mold of a traditional hero, allowing them instead to remain themselves, quiet, uncertain, but present, grounded, and willing. And this willingness becomes the central pillar of the climax, the emotional force that turns a small decision into a profound act of courage. And as the moment unfolds, you can feel the years of invisibility peeling away, revealing a person who has always had the capacity for strength but never believed they were allowed to show it. And the reactions that follow, those subtle changes in the faces of the supporting characters, the softening of tension, the shifting of unspoken boundaries, create one of the film's most moving payoffs, a moment of collective exhale in which the community acknowledges, perhaps for the first time, the heroism that has lived quietly among them, unseen but deeply felt. And as the emotional tide begins to settle, the film guides us into its resolution with the same gentle patience that has defined its entire storytelling approach, showing the slow healing of relationships, the tentative rebuilding of trust, and the way small acts can ripple outward to create lasting change. And while the film avoids tying every loose thread into a neat bow, it offers something far more meaningful, the assurance that growth continues even after the story ends, that the protagonist's journey is ongoing, and that the seeds planted throughout the narrative will continue to shape the characters' lives in ways that feel both realistic and emotionally satisfying. And among these closing scenes is one particularly tender moment, perhaps a simple gesture, a quiet smile, or a shared silence, that encapsulates the film's message with breathtaking clarity, reminding us that courage isn't measured by applause or recognition but by the willingness to continue showing up, day after day, even when the world isn't watching. And as we observe the protagonist moving through the world now, not as an invisible figure but as someone quietly seen, quietly respected, quietly changed, we realize that the film has crafted one of the rarest kinds of cinematic journeys, one that captures the beauty of ordinary heroism with such sincerity that it leaves you reflecting on your own life, your own overlooked moments, and the unnoticed people who carry the world on their shoulders without ever asking for acknowledgement. And in this reflection lies the true cultural impact of Pahlawan Terpandang, a film that resonates not because it shouts its message loudly but because it whispers it with unwavering conviction, inviting audiences to see the invisible labor that holds communities together, to appreciate the quiet sacrifices that rarely make headlines, and to recognize the value of lives that the world all too often ignores. and as the credits approach, the film doesn't end with a grand declaration but with a lingering emotional echo. A final image or moment that stays with you long after the screen fades to black, reminding you that stories like this matter, not because they dazzle, but because they reveal the profound humanity tucked into the corners of everyday life. And as I sat there taking in the final moments, I felt that unmistakable weight in my chest, the kind that comes from watching a film that doesn't just entertain but transforms you, that doesn't just tell a story but becomes a quiet companion to your own experiences. And as the last lines of narration melt into silence, I couldn't help but think about how rare it is to find a movie that trusts its audience so deeply, that invites them to slow down, to observe, to feel, and to honor the humble beauty of lives lived quietly but courageously. And that is why Pahlawan Terpandang stands out not just as a film but as a testament to the power of understated storytelling, a reminder that heroism lives not in spectacle but in sincerity, not in grand gestures but in the soft, steady resilience of the human spirit. And as I close this review, still carrying the emotional echoes of its final scenes, I find myself grateful for a film that sees the unseen, hears the unheard, and acknowledges the unacknowledged with such profound compassion, leaving us with a story that lingers like a whisper, urging us to notice the unnoticed in our own lives as we move through a world full of quiet heroes whose stories deserve to be told. And in the spirit of that quiet but powerful message, I leave you with one final question that feels perfectly fitting for a film like this. If Pahlawan Terpandang was a quiet thunderclap, a soft, lingering resonance that settled into the heart long after the final frame, then this continuation, this deeper exploration of its world, its emotional echoes, and its growing legacy, begins not with the gentle whisper of the original but with the weight of something larger pressing against the edges of the screen, as though the film's spirit has expanded, matured, and begun to reach for places it didn't yet know it could touch. And as I sat down to craft this follow-up review, to revisit the emotional footprints left behind by a story that found its strength not in spectacle but in sincerity, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the quiet hum of anticipation that comes only when returning to a world that felt so deeply lived in the first time, a world that understood the value of subtle courage, unspoken bonds, and the delicate architecture of ordinary heroism. And as the first scenes of this revisit flickered through my mind, I found myself reflecting not just on the characters and the narrative choices but on the experience of watching the film ripple outward into the world, shaping conversations, touching communities, and resonating with audiences who recognized in its quiet honesty something they'd been missing in the barrage of louder, flashier cinema. And this new script, this extended journey, begins with that reflection, with the sense that returning to Pahlawan Terpandang is less like revisiting a movie and more like walking back into a memory, one you didn't fully realize had become part of you until you stepped into it again. And before we continue on this long, unfolding path of emotional analysis and cinematic exploration, please subscribe to my channel Scenecraft Review, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because as we step deeper into the thematic chambers of this extended conversation, I want you with me every step of the way, not just as a viewer but as a companion navigating the quiet depths of a film that continues to reveal new layers the longer you sit with it. And what makes this extended exploration so fascinating is the way the film's subtlety becomes its strength, because in a world overflowing with stories that demand attention through volume, Pahlawan Terpandang continues to turn heads by doing the opposite, by whispering, by observing, by revealing the emotional landscapes of its characters not in grand gestures but in the cracks between moments, the barely noticeable gestures, the silences that ache with meaning. And that restraint is precisely why, in revisiting its themes, its cultural impact, and its long emotional aftershocks, I find even richer soil to dig into, soil that holds the roots of unspoken cultural nuances, the quiet architecture of community life, and the lived experiences of people whose stories rarely reach the big screen, yet shape the world in ways far more profound than most narratives dare to acknowledge. And as I immerse myself again in the film's world, I'm reminded of how its visual language carries a weight all its own, how the cinematography frames ordinary life with the reverence of a painting, how the lighting brings out textures of fatigue, tenderness, and longing I didn't fully appreciate on the first watch, and how the score lingers like an exhale held just long enough to remind you that the simplest sounds, the rustle of fabric, the distant echo of footsteps, the quiet hum of a street at dusk, can reveal volumes about a character's state of mind, and diving deeper into this expanded review feels like peeling another layer off a story that has lived long enough in my thoughts to become something more than fiction, something that mirrors the subtle moral dilemmas and emotional compromises we navigate in our own lives. And what strikes me most in this second journey is how the protagonist, once defined by invisibility, becomes a mirror reflecting the hidden corners of our own fears and hopes, because there is something universally resonant about feeling unseen, about carrying burdens no one acknowledges, about yearning for recognition without knowing whether we deserve it. And this sequel-style examination isn't about rehashing the moments we already explored but about bringing a deeper lens to the emotional terrain beneath them, uncovering the quiet psychological evolution that the film hints at but never forces into explicit dialogue, an evolution that reveals itself in posture, in pacing, in the soft tremor of hesitation before a choice is made. And as I follow the protagonist's journey once more, retracing the steps from invisibility to reluctant responsibility, I find myself noticing the way the community's gaze shifts around them, not dramatically or suddenly but through a gradual softening, a recognition that feels earned, not bestowed. And that earned quality lies at the very core of the film's emotional integrity, reminding us that true heroism is not an identity bestowed upon someone but a quiet evolution born out of necessity, empathy, and a willingness to respond to the world's subtle calls for help. And in this expanded review, the space between those emotional beats grows even richer, allowing us to explore the layers of communal dynamics, unspoken social rules, and intergenerational expectations that shaped the protagonist long before the events of the film began. Because if we are to understand the depth of their transformation, we must also understand the invisible structures that held them in place, the expectations that kept them quiet, the cultural norms that dictated when to speak and when to stay silent, and the understated pressure of living a life that feels predetermined by circumstances and community roles. And in re-examining these dynamics, the film opens up like a blooming flower, slowly, quietly, naturally, revealing petals you did not see before, colors you did not notice, patterns that were always there but required a more attentive gaze to appreciate. And that's part of what makes this extended exploration so satisfying, the realization that Pahlawan Terpandang rewards you for returning, for paying attention, for sitting with it long enough to understand that its emotional architecture was never designed for a quick experience but for a lingering, contemplative one. And as I continue examining the character arcs, I find myself drawn again and again to the supporting cast, individuals whose roles may seem small but whose presence forms the emotional scaffolding of the protagonist's journey. And in this long-form review, I finally have the room to unpack them, to explore how the neighbor with the stoic expression hides a history of loss etched into the worn lines around her eyes, how the child's innocent curiosity serves as a subtle counterpoint to the protagonist's emotional weariness, or how the secondary character, the unexpected catalyst of transformation, embodies a quiet resilience shaped not by strength but by vulnerability, by the courage to be open in a world that often punishes emotional honesty. And each of these characters becomes even more compelling under a deeper lens, revealing layers of humanity that extend beyond the film's narrative into broader reflections on community, survival, and the silent ways people influence each other's lives. And the more time I spend with them in this extended exploration, the more I realize that the film isn't just about one unsung hero but about an ecosystem of invisible contributors, people whose unacknowledged labor, compassion, and endurance form the backbone of the story's thematic soul. And the film's cultural impact becomes even more evident the longer you sit with it, because its resonance did not come from global marketing campaigns or flashy trailers. It came from recognition, from the way viewers across different backgrounds found fragments of themselves in the protagonist's journey, from the way communities discussed the film not in terms of plot points but in terms of emotional truth. And as this extended review continues in the parts ahead, we will explore how the film has influenced conversations about quiet heroism, about the value of unnoticed labor, and about the way stories rooted in cultural specificity can ultimately speak to universal human experiences, weaving a cinematic tapestry that transcends borders, time, and language. As I sink further into this expanded journey through the emotional and cinematic layers of Pahlawan Terpandang, the deeper I look, the more I realize that this film isn't simply watched, it's absorbed, like rainwater seeping into dry earth, filling cracks you didn't even know were there. And it's in this second part of our long-form exploration that I want to push past the surface impressions and dive into the emotional undercurrents that shape the film's heart, because while the first script revisited the broad strokes of the story, this examination lets us slide into the finer textures, the overlooked details, the subtle choices, the unspoken truths that make this film feel less like a narrative artifact and more like a living, breathing testament to the quiet resilience embedded in ordinary lives. And what stands out immediately in this deeper analysis is the way the film treats time. Not as a series of plot checkpoints or dramatic turning points, but as a fluid experience. A river that ebbs and flows around the characters, shaping them gently but persistently, and the more I sit with it, the more I recognize how deliberate this is, how the pacing isn't just slow for the sake of aesthetic but slow in a way that mirrors real emotional evolution, allowing the characters space to struggle, doubt, hesitate, and grow at a pace that feels painfully, beautifully human. Because growth doesn't happen in a single montage or epiphany, it happens in the quiet moments, the pauses, the conversations that seem inconsequential until you look back and realize they were the emotional hinges upon which everything else turned. And in this stretch of the expanded review, I find myself particularly drawn to the film's depiction of internal conflict, especially in the protagonist, whose journey from invisibility to reluctant recognition carries a weight that becomes even more apparent when viewed through a philosophical lens. And what fascinates me is that the film never frames this journey as a quest for glory but as a struggle for self-acceptance, a grappling with the fear that stepping into visibility will expose flaws, weaknesses, and insecurities that anonymity conveniently hid. And this theme, when examined closely, reveals a profound commentary on how many people move through the world carrying invisible burdens, worried less about failure and more about being seen failing. And the film captures this anxiety with such emotional precision that the protagonist's hesitations become universal, echoing the fears we all carry, the fear of not being enough, of being misinterpreted, of being thrust into roles we're not prepared for. And as we watch the protagonist navigate these dilemmas, the surrounding community becomes an indispensable part of the emotional landscape, not just as background characters but as mirrors reflecting the protagonist's internal journey, each of them carrying their own invisible struggles that gently intersect with and influence the protagonist's path. And it's here, in these intersections, that the film's true emotional architecture reveals itself, because every character, no matter how minor their screen time, contributes to the protagonist's transformation, whether by offering a moment of unexpected kindness, by revealing vulnerabilities the protagonist subconsciously recognizes in themselves, or by silently witnessing small acts of courage that the protagonist assumed would go unnoticed. And in this extended analysis, I find myself reflecting on how these moments build upon one another, how they collectively create a soft pressure that pushes the protagonist to confront truths they've buried beneath layers of routine and resignation. And one scene in particular keeps resurfacing in my mind, a moment I didn't fully appreciate until revisiting the film for this deeper dive, where the protagonist pauses on a dimly lit street, frozen for just a heartbeat as they watch life move around them, the shopkeepers closing stalls, the distant chatter of families returning home, the soft glow of lamps being lit. And in that suspended moment, you see something shift behind their eyes, a quiet realization that the world is larger and more interconnected than they ever allowed themselves to believe. And this scene, though small, encapsulates a turning point not because of what happens externally but because of what subtly realigns internally. And the more I reflect on scenes like this, the more I'm convinced that Pahlawan Terpandang uses silence as its most powerful storytelling tool, crafting emotional impact not through dialogue-heavy confrontations but through carefully composed imagery that lets viewers project their own emotions onto the screen, becoming co-authors in the storytelling process. And this collaborative emotional experience is part of what gives the film its lingering aftertaste, the sense that it stays with you not because of its plot but because it makes you feel seen in ways you didn't expect. And as I continue peeling back the layers in this extended review, I find myself drawn to the secondary characters more intensely, because their quiet humanity offers a kaleidoscope of perspectives that deepen the protagonist's evolution, from the neighbor whose silence initially feels cold but eventually reveals a lifetime of unspoken grief, to the child whose innocent optimism reminds the protagonist and the audience of the fragile hope that persists even in the most difficult circumstances. And perhaps most compelling of all is the catalyst character we discussed earlier, whose presence radiates a kind of soft resilience that challenges the protagonist without ever forcing their hand, serving as both a mirror and a guide, a reminder that vulnerability is not weakness but a form of courage that often goes unnoticed. And in examining their relationship more deeply, I begin to see how the film subtly constructs emotional binaries, visibility and invisibility, strength and fragility, duty and desire, self-preservation and sacrifice, yet refuses to treat them as opposites, instead blending them together in a way that feels truer to the complexities of real human experience, and this blending becomes even more striking in the film's treatment of community dynamics, especially in the way it portrays collective responsibility, mutual reliance, and the delicate balance between personal boundaries and shared burdens. And the more I analyze this aspect, the more I appreciate how the film resists romanticizing community life, instead portraying it with honesty, the warmth, the tension, the unspoken rules, the quiet judgments, the gentle protections, the fragile trust that can either bind people together or unravel under the strain of conflict. And revisiting this dynamic reveals a deeper layer of thematic richness centered around the idea that every community, no matter how humble, contains within it a constellation of unsung heroes, individuals who carry emotional labor, offer support, make sacrifices, and hold things together without recognition or reward. And it's this collective heroism that becomes even more pronounced upon re-watching the film, because while the protagonist's journey offers a focal point for the story's emotional movement, the supporting characters embody the broader truth that heroism is rarely a solitary act but a shared experience rooted in compassion, empathy, and the quiet determination to keep going even when no one notices. And as this expanded analysis deepens,